Chapter 32. Bong. General Kim Bong sat in a tiny briefing room listening to reports from various analysts coming in from the mainland. Min Ju Chu sat dutifully to Bong's right, listening, but refraining from any interaction with either Bong or the Chinese general's staff. The reports indicated Bong's convoy was able to push through Oregon and into California with minimal resistance along the way, mostly due to an absence of American military in the region. Bong's earlier briefing included the aerial assessment of the invasion, which consisted mostly of predictable news, some losses, some victories. That was to be expected when facing an adversary as capable as the United States on their own soil. His control of the skies reached inland nearly 100 miles before the data indicated the Americans held a slightly upper hand. Today's ground force briefing troubled Bong much more than any information he'd received during his morning aerial briefing. One of the Special Forces teams sent in to garner support from local government officials had failed miserably, and it was apparent to Bong why. If he'd only waited another 2 weeks, the American population would have been pushed past the point of caring who was providing the aid. As it stood now, 75% of his effort to harness local government officials had failed. One town, in particular, was especially bothersome in that the team working the region had been set upon, and more than half its members were dead or wounded. Petaluma was written in English at the top of the folder his intelligence chief handed him. The Petaluma city government had appeared to be possibly receptive to assistance from the North Koreans at first, but after only 2 meetings, the 6-man team was ambushed, and all but one of the team had been killed. Shortly after that disaster, an APC manning a checkpoint had been badly damaged, and 9 men were killed while another one was missing in action. Bong breathed in deeply as he read through the information printed within the worrisome folder. Whether one was the victor or the loser, he knew war was a series of uncomfortable events and tried using that knowledge to calm his rising concern. Although the North Koreans had lost several men during the push south through Oregon, none of the incidents came close to the sheer numbers of dead happening in the Petaluma area. In Redding, an unknown sniper shot and killed a KPA soldier. Another soldier fell from a moving APC and succumbed to his injuries. All were normal attrition of war events involving loss of human life, but this Petaluma depot bothered Bong. All the way from Oregon, there had not been anything close to an organized resistance until now. He knew it could be simply a bunch of Americans getting lucky a couple of times, or it could be something bigger, far deadlier to his mission of securing the convoy route, and he wasn't about to wait and see if it was a one-off. That the killings were occurring in and around a very important refueling depot just outside of one of the largest cities in the state made his decision an easy one. He reached into a separate folder, one he'd brought, and one whose contents had been prepared by his own hand. He slid the folder across the table to North Korean General Min Ju Chu, then dipped his head and sat back to wait while the other general read the documents. The further Chu read through the documents, the more pinched his features grew. Bong wasn't about to show any level of contriteness as he sat impassively waiting for Chu's response. When Chu finished reading, he slid the documents back into the folder and pushed it towards Bong. Unnecessary. Bong's plastic smile made him look like a wax figure as he laid both hands on the table's top and studied their backs. When his eyes rose to meet Chu's, they were the eyes of a reptile, unreadable and therefore unsettling to Chu. I disagree. General Bong, Chu started, his voice just a little too oily. War is something more than a series of tragedies endured in order to achieve an objective. We both know this entire operation would not come without some loss. Bong bowed his head gravely, as though preparing to bestow great knowledge on a naive younger colleague. North Korea failures in the theater have placed China in a particularly sensitive position in regard to world perception. This occupation has to be done by North Korea for the sole purpose of leaving China in merely a supportive role, with much less exposure to criticism from the rest of the world. Now that your men have failed in their mission, I am forced to shift China's role in this war. A shift, I might add, that troubles me greatly." Chu leaned forward, his face reddening at the slight by Bong. "My men have not failed. They have succeeded up and down the west coast of the Americas. A few casualties certainly can't be labeled a failure. Even you must see this, General Bong. Where you see casualties of war, I see the true potential of a catastrophic collapse if allowed to continue unchecked. What you fail to recognize is the true fighting spirit of the American people. You can beat the snake, even kill it, but the poisonous fangs remain a deadly threat and must be managed as such." Chu relaxed back into his seat. The rest of the intelligence analysts in the room shifted uncomfortably in theirs. Before Chu could speak, Bong rapped a finger on the folder. "Special Operations Forces will be sent into the area to clean up any resistance before it can gain a foothold. The survivors of your team in the area will be folded into the refueling depot's security forces while the SOF teams finish the job. This is not an affront to you or your men. It is only a minor adjustment needed to ensure the safety of the convoy." Chu took the change as a major insult and fought to control his temper as he listened to Bong's orders. When Bong finished speaking, Chu spoke calmly. "Stir the grass and startle the snake, General." It was Bong's face that reddened now. He stared back at the insubordinate Korean. "If North Korean had been able to crush the snake's head, we wouldn't be having this uncomfortable conversation, Min-ju," he shot back, using Chu's first name in place of his military rank and last name. The conversation was over. Chu knew that the moment Bong addressed him in the manner he had. There would be no arguing his country's case. He would do as Bong ordered, whether he liked it or not. The Chinese SOF teams were fairly new to China's specialized capabilities. Their recent appearance on the battlefield meant they lacked many of the mission capabilities mastered years before by the Americans' Combat Application Group, England's SAS troopers, and several other more tenured Special Forces units around the world. The SOF teams focused more on direct action missions and were more akin to the U.S. Army Rangers than they were to the more esoteric units in the free world. Both Bong and Chu were not starry-eyed children when it came to their militaries in the theater of competence. To reach the rank of general, one had to walk a tightrope, hanging between the hardships of reality and the tripwires of mindless political loyalty to the regime. Both were proud military men, and of the two, Bong possessed the greatest understanding of the global impact of what they were doing here in the West. Chu understood the military aspect of the operation, but lacked a comprehensive understanding of how his actions affected the rest of the world, and most importantly, China. North Korea was a pariah, and that wasn't likely to change anytime soon, but China enjoyed a seat at the table of world powers. Although a complete fabrication, China had a reputation to protect, and Bong was committed to safeguarding his country's interest, no matter the cost. Like all other SOF teams in the PLA, the small 12-man unit bouncing its way across the unusually choppy Pacific waters were trained under the newest military doctrine adopted by the Chinese SOF community started in the early 1990s. Every team was trained to infiltrate unseen into enemy territories while maintaining a three-dimensional, all-weather approach. They were skilled in the use of submarines, high-speed boats, open-water swim, and scuba. Additionally, the SOF teams were adept in air insertion methods, including, but not limited to, airborne operations, powered parachutes, and helicopter campaigns. China's absolute vastness, coupled with the country's countless geographical settings, lent itself to multi-environmental training scenarios. That enabled the SOF teams to hone their skill sets in a myriad of unique niches such as mountainous terrain, desert, and even amphibious and riverine obligations. Even with such extensive training, the SOF community lacked the complex SM-plastic capabilities of the America's Tier 1 military units and even some of the Tier 2 units such as the SEAL teams and Marine Raider Regiment. The rigidity of the Chinese culture hadn't evaporated enough within the SOF community to allow them to fully embrace their full potential, but they were slowly getting there. Although the Chinese SOF team in the boat skipping across the wave tops was well trained and had spent hundreds of hours in similar conditions, none of them had ever snuck into America. The fact wasn't lost on a single member of the team as they drew closer to the American shoreline. They had all been briefed on the KPA team that had preceded them, and to a man were prepared for a fight the moment they were feet dry. Their mission was different than any they'd been involved in, and not just because it was to take place on American soil. They were to penetrate the coastline, move to a populated area, and conduct surveillance on local activities in and around an established refueling depot being used by the convoy that ran nearly the entire length of the western coastline. In the event the team identified an element deemed a danger to the depot, they were to make an example of the members of said group. The tactic was intended to send a chilling message to any and all persons who might consider taking up arms against their Chinese and North Korean occupiers. Before the coast came into view, the Chinese commandos saw the frothy white of the waves crashing on the ragged Northern California coastline. A major portion of their briefing had been the dangers of the surf in that area and all along the California coast. The commandos were shown commercial surfing photographs taken just an hour south of their intended landing point during a surf competition known as Mavericks near Half Moon Bay. There was never a set date for the competition since the biggest waves showed up on their own timetables, but the competition usually occurred in the winter months, with massive waves appearing as early as October. The current surf reports were nowhere near the massive 30 and even 40-foot high waves known to swell along the Northern California shores, but the men were ready and tense after the eye-opening briefing on big wave surfing in their area of operation. As they neared the surf line, the boat's pilot slowed to an idle, searching for an opening to power through the 8-foot breakers before motoring his team to shore. The technique for pushing through a surf line was fairly simple during daylight operations, but could be vastly more complicated at night. Identifying the surf line was an absolute necessity to a successful beach landing, and if the pilot failed this first step, the boat could be capsized, causing loss of equipment and oftentimes lives. The sound of the breaking waves was one indicator, but the phosphorescence in the watery foam caused by the dinoflagellates was the best visual aid a pilot could hope for in the darkness of night. Once a surf line was identified, the pilot waited for a developing wave to pass the boat, then powered onto the back of the wave. He guided the craft forward, riding the backside of the wave while remaining somewhat in the trough of the trailing wave. Once the wave broke, the pilot applied more power, launching the craft forward and onto shore. When the bow of the craft struck the sandy beach, the pilot kept the throttle pinned forward while the men piled over the sides of the craft and then tugged it onto the beach. The team worked efficiently to move the boat from the beach and went right to work disabling the craft. Since they wouldn't be using it for their return trip, they weren't worried about it being discovered, but they would make sure it couldn't be used. The 12 Chinese SOF men left the boat where they'd landed at Muir Beach and began climbing the shoreline, headed to their pickup point on Shoreline Highway. Muir Beach was perfect in that it allowed them to move to the south through the trailheads instead of inhabited neighborhoods on their way to their meet location. 2 hours after navigating the 8-foot surf, the 12 SOF men sat in the back of a light armored vehicle dispatched to their location for pickup. No words were spoken between either the team members or the crew of the vehicle as it made its way back towards Highway 101, where it would then travel north to Petaluma. Upon their arrival at the Washington Street overpass, the 12 Chinese SOF men stepped out of the armored vehicle and were met by the North Korean officer in charge of the refueling depot. Chung Hee-yun was a junior field officer in the KPA holding the rank of Wee. Yun was in charge of the security forces at the refueling depot. Yun was 33 years old and, like most North Koreans around that age, appeared to be in his 50s. A hard life coupled with bouts of malnutrition, poor living conditions, unhealthy vices, and a litany of other hardships associated with living under the iron fist of his supreme leader all precipitated his premature aging. Ling Vang, the team leader of the 12-man Chinese SOF unit, held a similar rank, but clearly viewed himself as answering to no one but his Chinese masters. Vang was 31 years old, arrogant and proud, a quality that worked both in his favor and against him. Vang's value within the SOF community kept the wolves at bay and allowed him to speak his mind to a certain extent without the normal party fallout that usually accompanied criticism of the military in any form. When Vang crossed a line, a quiet whisper was blown into his ear, reminding him that even he was bound by the shackles of his oppressive government's wish to remain unchallenged. He never acquiesced, but he did explain his reasonings for whatever trespass he'd committed. His knowledge of special operations was so detailed, his seniors were constantly forced to consider his transgressive speech and figure out ways to follow his abrasive suggestions in order to better China's SOF community. Yun exited the rear hatch of an idling APC, his face devoid of emotion. He'd been waiting for his own KPA Special Operations Unit to return and fold into his existing force, but the sight of the Chinese men told Yun he was no longer in command of the refueling depot. "Good morning," Young began, then stopped when Vang ignored him. Vang stood under the overpass assessing the layout of the terrain, men, and equipment. He turned slowly in a 360-degree arc, his brown eyes drinking in every detail of the refueling depot. Pivoting smartly back to Yun, Vang wrinkled his nose. "Any problems?" Yun's chin rose as he struggled to control his anger. "Nothing more than should be expected." Vang snorted at Yun's attempt to divest from the reality of his situation. He'd received an exhaustive briefing prior to coming ashore and was aware of the decimation of the KPA Special Forces Unit, the recent ambush, and subsequent killing of nearly a dozen KPA soldiers, and the destruction of an armored APC. "If losing men and equipment is something the KPA expects, we are in trouble." Before Yun could respond, Vang continued, his words harsh. "I do not expect any casualties. I will never accept failure, where my men and I are concerned. This means you no longer have that luxury. Do we understand each other?" Yun's nostrils flared as his face flushed with anger. "No one here expects failure, but from time to time we are forced to endure its embrace," Yun sputtered. "Do we understand each other?" Vang snapped, completely ignoring Yun's feeble attempt to defend himself. "Of course I understand your position, and my men will do whatever it takes to ensure the safety and security of this installation for as long as the Supreme Leader deems our presence here needed." Vang drew a long breath in through his nose, his eyes boring holes in Young. "My radio man will coordinate with yours, and then we will leave. But first, I want to talk to your wounded team leader, Dong Jin Ji." Yun shook his head. "Ji is in the field. Even I do not know his whereabouts." "Call him on the radio and have him return here immediately," Vang barked, before turning on his heel and stalking off to where the rest of his team waited. Vang instructed his assistant team leader to set up an observation position and use the rest of the men to set up their own perimeter until he could debrief G. Next, he sent his communications man to meet with Yun and his man in order to arrange for future communications activities. That would include radio frequencies, as well as check-in times, including alternates for both. Left by himself, Vang again examined the entire area before moving to the cement slope under the overpass and dropping his pack. He sat erect next to his gear, rifle in hand, muzzle jutting skyward, waiting. Although he appeared outwardly to be patiently biding his time until G arrived, he was in fact seething inside, his perceived stoicism only a product of his staunch military discipline and not at all genuine. Even though to the untrained eye, patience and composure resembled each other, they could not have been more different. Young glanced over after he steered Vang's radio man towards his own comm center, but made no attempt to reconnect with Vang. Instead, he entered the rear hatch of the still idling APC and pulled the door shut behind him, a small and ineffectual act of indifference. "Incompetent coward," Vang murmured in a low growl. It was one thing to be tasked with a fresh, direct-action mission, but it was an entirely different affair to be asked to come in and clean up another team's failure. Personally, Vang didn't possess a very high opinion of the KPA and its beleaguered soldiers. That, and the fact he failed miserably to hide his feelings when it came to the ineptness of the other soldiers, caused a great deal of tension within the camp, and he'd only just arrived. 30 minutes later, Vang's radio man approached. "The KPA team is about 2 hours out. Other than that, we are ready to leave." Vang bowed his head in acknowledgement, and the man trotted off to rejoin his comrades on the perimeter. In the darkened belly of the APC, Young watched Vang's lone figure, seated on the concrete slope. Vang remained vigilant, his head sweeping from side to side, his rifle held firm in his hands, ready to be deployed into action if necessary. Young's scowl laid bare his distaste for the Chinese officer's presence inside the perimeter of his refueling depot, but there was nothing he could do about it. After leaving his motherland and being briefed on his mission, he'd realized almost immediately that North Korean soldiers were but pawns in China's quest to control the West. That realization made him resent his Chinese allies and wish North Korea had the resources to go this war alone. He understood it wasn't possible, which further irritated him as he sat in quiet solitude inside the safety of the APC, while the man he was quickly coming to loathe sat outside on the wire, watching, waiting, and ready.